President, first of all, I want to commend my friend and colleague, the senator from Louisiana, who I know the Senate has heard repeatedly over the last few weeks, relentlessly over the last few weeks, come back time and again on this issue around small business. I think many Americans are getting a chance to see what those of us who have the privilege of serving with Mary Landrieu see regularly. This is somebody who doesn't take no. This is someone who is, I know we sometimes need to prod her to come out of her shell, but this is someone who is so passionate about the people of Louisiana, and in her role as chair of the Small Business Committee has been a tireless voice for small businesses, not just in Louisiana, but in Virginia, New Mexico, all across the country. So I want to join the majority leader and others in commending her for her stick-to-itness on this critical piece of legislation. I want to add a couple of other comments as well. I concur as well with the senator from Louisiana on the issue of 1099. We do need to have an accurate way to ensure that the standing law, the law that's been the law of the land for 62 years, is enforced. But this process of filing a 1099 at a $600 threshold at this moment in time was way overburdensome. I, like the senator from Louisiana, and I think most members heard that loud and clear. And we do need to fix that. And I look forward to working with Senator Landrieu. I know Senator Begich and others have been involved in those efforts, and I look forward to joining them in this effort. I want to just take a moment or two, and I know the presiding officer and others, our time is about up before we break for our caucus lunches, but I think it's really important, and the pieces of this bill have been emphasized time and again. The lending facility, small businesses can take capital in if they increase their percentage of lending, particularly helpful to small banks that might be in challenging financial times at this point. The SBA, replenishment of funding for the SBA. There's one message I came and brought out everywhere across Virginia over the last month and a half was the SBA of today is not your grandfather's or even your daddy's SBA. It wasn't even 5 years ago's SBA. The SBA under Administrator Karen Mills is much less bureaucratic, much more streamlined with the work that the Small Business Committee has done in terms of upping the guarantees. The SBA's role and the type of businesses the SBA has served during this crisis has expanded dramatically. Just look at the number of banks who participate now with the SBA today versus 18 months ago. That remarkably successful effort ground to an immediate halt in June when funding ran out. Why in the heck it has taken us this long simply to replenish that proven program that doesn't add to the deficit is one of the things that get a lot of folks in Virginia and Louisiana and New Mexico scratching their heads. There's another piece of this bill, one that the chairman was kind enough to work with me and others on, that builds upon an existing initiatives in the private sector in, I believe, about 26 states, a capital access program that helps those marginal small business loans become more bankable. Because as I hear the same concerns that the chair of the Small Business Committee hears, small businesses can't get their loans, although I got to say it's not always the banker's fault, because let's face it, a lot of small businesses today are not as financially healthy as they were 2 years ago. If they got real estate as collateral, it's decreased in value. If they are lending on cash flows, they've decreased as well. So how do we take that otherwise healthy small business in good times and in normal recessions and not let them fall off the cliff in this deepest recession since the Great Depression? The Capital Access Program is one place where a borrower will be charged a couple of extra points. We will go in from the government and match those points, and we can create a first dollar loss, separate loss reserve pool for a whole series of loans. Another $30 to $60 billion of capacity in that aspect. And then finally, what's not to like about the series of small business tax credits that's also been built into this legislation? So I commend the chairperson of the Small Business Committee. I'm glad the Senate has come to its senses on this issue. Candidly, I wish we would have passed this legislation last spring, but better late than never. I want to add two other points that I think are important. As one other piece of legislation, bipartisan piece of legislation, that we passed recently, and I would be curious to know the chair of the Small Business Committee response on this, was the financial reform bill. A very important piece of legislation. And we set appropriately in that financial reform bill the requirement for banks to set higher capital standards. The challenge we have right now is starting to implement those higher capital standards right now in the trough of the recession. Sends a very mixed message to our bankers and to our regulators. And I hope that the chair of the Small Business Committee and I and others can think about how we work with our regulators at the FDIC and the OCC and the Fed to ensure that while we want to build up the capital reserves and make our banks healthier, that some level of forbearance for those small business performing loans that may not meet every covenant in their loan document because their real estate has depreciated in value, somehow we have to have some flex. Because what we are doing by having the regulators come down so hard on the banks at this point is we are in many ways, even with this very good program that Senator Landrieu has put out, we are strangling that recovery because of this mixed message. And the final point I want to make is, with this piece of small business legislation, I think it may be, again, it's not going to be a single silver bullet, but one piece of good news that I don't think we would come back to enough in these discussions is that not only have large banks recovered nicely since the decline, but large cap companies, the Fortune 1000 companies, their balance sheets today are healthier today than they've ever been. There is north of $2 trillion in cash sitting on Fortune 1000 balance sheets. We need, and one of the things I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues on, and how we get that cash off the sidelines and back investing in the market. And when they invest in the market and the large companies go to their supply chain, which is the small businesses, those small businesses have to get the credit as well to keep functioning. So this piece of legislation is important not only to small businesses, but as large cap companies start to spend out as well, it is important to the overall economic recovery. But I would ask my friend, my colleague, the leader on this important piece of legislation, if she might have some ideas as well about how we meet that appropriate long-term financial goal of making our financial standards appropriate, but not send this mixed message to regulators so that those small business loans that are still performing have the appropriate forbearance to get through this trough in the recession.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. President, the senator from Virginia is absolutely correct, and he has put his finger on two pending and very serious problems. One is the regulation direction being driven by some of the new legislation we've passed. Of course, he would know this because as a member of the Banking Committee, he has been such a strong advocate for common sense regulation and supporting community banks. So he is absolutely correct, and you do have my commitment through the Small Business Committee to keep this issue alive and in view so that we can find some appropriate solutions, Senator. I think that he raises an absolutely very key point. The second point the senator from Virginia has put his finger on is the $2 trillion in capital just sitting there. One thing that may spur their interest is the zero capital gains rate in this bill. Should they take some of that $2 trillion in capital and invest in some small businesses that have a capitalization level below $50 million, that's one thing that could help encourage them. They will pay no tax, none, on the money that they earn through that investment, which should be an incentive. But there are some additional things I think we could do, and I would like to work with you, Senator, because your leadership is really very needed at this time, and your particular background as a successful business person, as a governor. So you're right, this bill is not a silver bullet, it's a good first step, but there are some other things we need to do as quickly as we can, and I look forward to working with you on those two and others in the weeks to come.
Mr. President?
Senator from Virginia is recognized.
Again, I'll close my comments and again thank the chairman of the Small Business Committee for her leadership on this bill. We would not be here today but for her relentlessness on this legislation. This legislation has had more hurdles, many of them false hurdles, put in its face, and Senator Landrieu just doesn't know how to say no when it affects the well-being of small businesses, which are the lifeblood of job creation coming out of recession. I thank her for her leadership, look forward to continuing to work with her, and I yield the floor.